Welcome to Vermont Artists and Authors, where we interview great storytellers and artists from the amazing Green Mountain State. This is episode 40. I'm your host, Barney Smith of storycomic.com, and we're honored to have with us the highly regarded and acclaimed authors of Uncertain Fruit, Rebecca and Sallyann Majoya.
Thank you.
Hey, how's it going?
Glad to be here.
Good.
Right. So I gotta say, so we connected through Rootstock Publishing, and you published a book that came out this past September, in September 2022. And one of the things that you talked about in this book is that it is a book that you tell a story. It's a dual memoir, which I'm really excited to talk about how that went. But it's about a story that people don't really talk about much. So
Sallyann and I have been together now for 21 years.
Woo!
And a few years into being together, we decided to get married and decided to grow our family. And we had a long struggle with infertility and had tried different ways toward adoption as well, and had what they call either a reclaim or a failed adoption. So you have the baby for a certain amount of time and then the baby's reclaimed. But throughout all of that is also, it's our love story. So
yes. So we provide context around the thread of a story that is about the adoption reclaim or the adoption loss, which takes place in a small town in Vermont.
Right. And now and so as you mentioned in some of your previous interviews and in other places, you're talking about you wanted to kind of tell this story as part of it's that you want to write this for others that might be going the same thing, but you also kind of wrote it for yourselves. So how did that process go with, as it was happening and where you stood? What was that conversation that the two of you had together to say, let's write this down? Because you both have a background in writing as well, correct?
Correct. Yes. Yeah. In fact, I think on our first date, we talked about our interest in being writers.
Yes.
Actually. Yeah.
And what avid readers we are. We're both incredibly avid readers and love to write.
And I think after we lost the baby, which was very much like a death for us, we ran away from home, and we were fortunate enough to have the liberty to do that and work from home long before it became popular. And during that process, we were living in a 24-foot RV, and we were looking for other resources out there that told something similar to our story, and we couldn't find anything.
We find all these adoption books or books about infertility, and they always, all of them, just had this tied up with a bow ending. No matter what the struggle was, the things they went through, it's like they always. And it was just, it's hard when you're in a space where you've been in this for almost 10 years and the happy ending isn't happening.
Yes.
And I'm starting to feel like I'm going to age out. And so I wanted people to know. And as we talk to people, we realize we're not the only ones.
We're not alone in this, certainly.
Went through this. Yeah.
And we really started writing initially for our own healing, because that's just what we did.
We've journaled to process things even before the infertility thing. It's just something we both do a lot to process what we're thinking and feeling and whatever. But it was really powerful during this healing journey because, we were able to be together 24/7, which not everyone can do when they're grieving
or want
to, right? Depends on your personality and your relationship. But it was really powerful and wonderful for us in the long run because we got to be together. And often you wake up in the night, you wake up especially when you're stressed about something and you just can't go back to sleep, and there's something you're ruminating about, you're angry or you're whatever. So often we would write in the night.
Yeah, I used to say that the muse tended to call me around 2:00 in the morning. Yes, and you have to listen to the muse.
We go like, damn new muse, let me go to sleep.
Yes.
And then we wake up in the morning and be like, did you write last night? Because I hope I didn't wake you up. And we would read to each other.
Right.
what we had, and it's a great way to know, like in a grief process, where the other person is at, because it isn't. We all know these stages of grief now, but they're not linear.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes I'm ready to, I'd like to just go throw things,
Mm-hmm.
shatter glass or something would feel really good.
Mm-hmm.
The same day that Sallyann might be in a whole different space.
Right. And conversely, there are times when, one of us is in our own little shell,
Mm-hmm.
and it might have helped pull the other person out a little bit too.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. I think initially when we first started writing, we did have this idea of like, okay, we're gonna have some kind of a grief book or something to help other people,
Or even an article,
yeah,
like something. I'm not sure we knew what it was, but we love
Mhm.
writing, so we thought some sort of
Mhm.
that's our creative process is writing,
Mhm.
and so we're going to do something with our grief to help other people
Yeah.
in some form.
Mhm.
And how did that book kind of evolve and change over time? Because as you're talking about taking some journaling pieces to it, and how did that process go to turn it into like something that would be conceivably published?
Well, this is where I say Sallyann is the magician, the true gifted. Like we have over 1,000 pages that we wrote in that
Wow.
first year.
Yeah,
Easily.
we have lots and lots of pages, and as we've talked about before, one grief touches upon another, so you're writing about things that you didn't even realize you were grieving from 20 years before,
When you were 7,
yeah.
or whatever,
Yeah,
it's like
because I was 27 when
it
this
just
happened. Not.
it just touches, all
Yeah.
of these different.
Yeah.
Meaningful things.
So I feel like that was a big piece of it. Was that?
Mhm. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and so I guess how, because this, as I say, the very unique aspect of this book is a dual memoir.
Mhm.
So because you're talking about some of your emotions and like the very intimate journey the two of you went through, how did you take off the narrator hat and the author hat? How did you switch those back and forth, and how did you have to do this as you say, as an editor piece, to say, I need to cut this out, I need to add this to it, while making sure that you're being true to each other's voices?
Yeah, Barney, that's a great question, and it took years for that to happen.
And we had 3 versions.
Yes.
The first
Wow,
version
okay.
was what, like
Mhm.
300 pages? It was much longer.
It was almost 400,
Almost
I think.
400
And we had
pages.
we kind of initially had more of a chronological piece, I
Yeah.
think, which,
Mm.
and we had some readers along the way. We had some friends and people we trusted who could read it and give us, really helpful feedback or little editing here and there.
One of the first version, one of
Mhm.
the pieces of feedback we got was, we want to hear more about your story,
Mhm.
your love story beyond the baby stuff.
Mhm. And I think that was helpful.
That was very
in
helpful.
giving the context that we ended up creating once we got to the final piece. But I mean, that took years. There was one point wherein I had a lot of Post-it notes up on the wall and for different, titles of pieces that we thought, oh, this is going to go here. And I was moving the Post-it notes all over the place. And there were pieces that made sense that we wrote about something that we ended up, combining with another piece, because they were very different times that we wrote them, but they ended up fitting very well together for a chapter.
Yeah.
So
yeah. And then pieces that were missing. There were a
Yeah.
few pieces that, as we were writing it, well, maybe we really need to have more about this, and so we would
fill in the gaps.
Yeah, here and there.
And I think that was a tricky piece, because we had friends, who certainly were like, wow, you have very different voices. So really like similar but different enough that like how do we pull this together so that it's readable for the
Right.
and but still maintains our voice and the integrity of our individual experience in the story. So.
And I think our experiences were different enough that we wanted very much to have both voices there. I have two children that I gave birth to from a previous marriage that we raised together in a way. Sallyann met them when they were 6 and 8 years old. So it was different in that sense. I had given birth to a baby, but there were other places that were really emotionally intense for me. And I had a hysterectomy, so I couldn't help her. I couldn't do anything. So there's that sticking.
Yeah, it sort of amplified the experience of the infertility.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And how did that go? Like when you're putting that together, at what point, because you mentioned before, and you also mentioned in a previous interview that you did have a friend who was a line editor that kind of helped you clean some stuff up through. How did that transition go from kind of keeping it close to the vest, only sharing with friends, to then, was that a big step to say, all right, this is someone I have no idea who this person is, and they're going to read it and work on that too? How was that step going to sharing it with friends to now bringing it down into strangers to look at the book?
I think once we got to that point, we felt pretty confident with where it was, wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
So it was nerve-wracking every time we handed it over. I mean, it's your baby, right?
But we
Essentially.
also, we knew Cheryl Rappe Adams, who
Yeah,
did
the line editor.
The line editor. We knew her. We'd worked with her on the campaign for gay marriage in the state of Vermont. She was
she was just a very pivotal advocate. Yes.
So at least she wasn't a complete stranger. Even the line editor wasn't a complete stranger. So we cheated a little bit there, if you will.
Yeah.
But she was so thorough. It was wonderful to be so thorough and go through every single line and be like, because we changed everybody's names except ours. In the book. And so, she caught a couple of places and we had played with different names for people. So she'd be like, oh, you know what? You accidentally, I think you mean, whatever, Sarah here, and you said Julia, can you check this? And it's like, oh my God, we did, like we screwed that up.
She was a phenomenal editor for sure. And I feel like all the people that edited in various ways, the ones that we knew better than others, gave, really useful feedback that I think it was always really important to listen to it and consider it and see what we could do to absorb it, at least.
And we do jump back. The thread is about the getting and losing that baby, but we jump back to our even our own childhoods in some areas. And so I think it was Cheryl, someone suggested putting the date in each chapter, like at least the year, which I think is very helpful to readers.
I think it was kind of the way that we had already done that, but they kind of the way they organized it a little bit differently for us. So
shifted a few things.
Shifted that a little bit. Yeah.
Because you mentioned before you had like 1,000 pages or so. How did you decide what was going to stay and what was going to go? And do you have any regrets of taking some parts out of the story that you wish you left in?
Oh, it was really a painful process in a lot of ways. I think the editing, I know Rebecca gives me a lot of credit for that, but it was very difficult because there were sections. In fact, there was a beautiful piece that Rebecca wrote, which I really would have loved to keep into it, but I think we kept coming back to what's our story. It was it was a constant act of refocusing. What is the thread here? What's our story? And does this really fit into this story?
Right.
And, or this may be beautiful as a standalone article. It may be great within, a thread of a whole different story. But
at the moth.
It was a very moving and meaningful piece. Maybe you can talk more about that, but
well, one of the pieces we cut, I had a third pregnancy, and I lost
in a previous relationship.
In my previous relationship, and lost the baby. I had a miscarriage, and it was very complicated for me. I was raised very right-wing, fundamental, born again, and of course, pro-life. And so when I went through this experience of being pregnant and not wanting to be pregnant the third time, but then losing the baby, it was very complicated for me. And I realized, you know, when I pictured people getting abortions, it wasn't a mother of two who thought she was about to get divorced. Like, that was not my stereotypical person lining up outside the abortion clinic. And so it made me really rethink all of that. And of course, it was just a few months before our book was published that Roe v. Wade was overturned. And I was like, oh, I wish it was still in there. But even though it's pertinent to life currently, it really would not have fit in the book because it wasn't about that. It wasn't about abortion. It wasn't about, you know.
It was about something that took place previously, but it wasn't, we wanted it to stay more to our story.
Yes. Yes. It kind of went back to
an old relationship,
which we didn't do.
Right.
Throughout the book. We stayed.
Yeah.
I mean, the relationship we discuss is with each other.
Yeah, I think it's a constant, as was our, you know, years of infertility, the continually checking in, you know, is this where you want to be? Is this what you want to continue to do? I think it was a lot like that too in the editing process. Is this where we want to be? And do we think that this should stay in here or shouldn't, or what, you know?
Does it feel too personal?
Yeah. And also we were thinking about our readers too. And you know, there were plenty of pieces that we wrote about that we also were like, we want to keep the reader reading the book. We don't want them to be like, this is so depressing.
We don't have to jump off a bridge or something. And that's some of the coolest feedback we've got is people say they cry and then a chapter later they're laughing, and that makes us very happy.
Right. I mean, so because you, as we said earlier, you both have written before. So how did your writing evolve during this process, writing a dual memoir?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
I think I've leaned toward way back, 30 years ago, I wrote some things for children's magazines and things like that. So it was very different. In high school and college, I wrote a lot of poetry. So over the years, I've just evolved a lot. Anyway, in different ways. I've written more articles and things like that.
Yeah, I don't think I feel like my writing has evolved over time. I mean, I wanted to write children's stories anyway. I don't think my first idea of getting published was to be writing a memoir, let alone a dual memoir. So I feel like I think that I learned a lot about myself through this process, all of it, of course, but especially the memoir piece, and not just myself, but a lot about Rebecca as well. And I feel like we did become better at communicating overall,
definitely,
as a result of the writing that we have done.
We created a very safe bubble. In because both of us, it really felt a lot like a death, which feels very much like the rug's pulled out from under you, like the whole world looks scary and shaky. And so and at this point when we lost the baby, we've been trying to have a baby for
almost 10 years,
so like 75% of our relationship together. We've been trying to, and I was really terrified that Sallyann might even just say, I can't even look at you anymore. I can't be here, because so the whole relationship felt very unstable and scary. And but then spending this time together and writing and talking about what we were feeling and what we were afraid of, and it made it a safe place to write exactly what we were feeling without holding back.
Yeah. And I think that was really important, that we stuck to the honesty and that rawness that, you know, a lot of people have mentioned. They can feel the rawness in our voices too, in our story. But I think it allowed us to be a little bit more open and raw with each other too. So
and is it a way too, because you're able to kind of go through the experience together, you creating something creating something as well from that symbolic perspective is
Mhm.
important. Would you do another dual memoir again?
Yes.
Oh, in a heartbeat, actually.
Really? Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right.
I mean, especially if I'm writing it with Rebecca.
Assumption is you mean with Sallyann.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what kind of advice would you give partners?
Lots of therapy. Lots of therapy. No.
Which we did that too. We did a lot of therapy through our relationship.
That did help.
Yeah.
That we actually had that as a foundation for our relationship.
Yeah.
And I think definitely it's really important to be willing to hold that space for the other person and allow them to express whatever it is that they need to express on paper or however they're writing it. I write everything by hand first, so of course I think on paper. And you may not be comfortable with what they have written about, especially if you're writing a memoir that is, as personal as this can be. That it's really important to give them that space and allow them to not just be who they are, not just jump on their words and be like, oh, I think you should have done this, but to give them the emotional space to go where they need to go. And it might take them to places that you're not comfortable with, but that's a really important piece, I think.
Because it gives it honesty. It gives it that honesty. But also I think we wrote on our own and then put it together, going back and forth from our voices. I can't imagine, like, I could never write like literally together, like sit together and try to like that one for me would never work. I mean, maybe that would work for other people, but I would say that would be one thing I'd say is like write your own stuff and then come together and look at it and don't be, I guess you can't take it personally. Like if something doesn't fit in the book, you have to have a thread. I mean, your life is, how many minutes in a year, you can't write it all. You can't, and nobody wants to read it all. It has to connect and be a thread. And just because something might feel powerful to you, if it doesn't connect to the story, it's not going to help it. It's not going to move it forward. And so you can't take it personally. You got to think, will it get to my audience? And will it connect with them if I leave this in or take it out?
Yeah, it's a definite balancing act as writing it as a partnership. Because you also want to make sure that you're reflecting both of the voices and that you're giving enough space and time in the book to hold those two voices there too. So I think it is really important for both partners writing it to, obviously everybody has their own processes. Some people might want to outline it together initially and then, but I think that that's the biggest piece is just that allowing the other, both people to have their own voice and then, and to also be able to be objective enough to stand away from it and allow it to be what it needs to be on its own.
Right. I mean, honestly, too, as you mentioned before, is like you never see a book about adoption that has like all of them have a happy ending. But I would argue this one has an ending that is that reaffirms like the commitment and love that you have for each other. So there is, I mean, there is a pretty positive in a way. I would argue there's a really strong ending to that as well. So
Very well put. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. It doesn't have the traditional adoption happy ending. But you're right. I feel like I won the lottery every day because I get to wake up next to Sallyann.
No.
Yeah. Unless she's up at 2:00 in the morning, right?
Then I'll just wake you up. Come on.
It's so funny because she writes everything longhand.
Yeah.
And I type everything on a laptop. And so it's funny too. Our processes are completely different.
Process is different. Yes.
And
I think we initially we initially actually started the process by reaching out to agents. I think that's where
Mhm,
we started.
mhm.
And we had some really wonderful agents who got back to us. But many of them said, you need to have a bigger platform, bigger social media platform. This is a moving memoir, but we're not going to be able to support you this way unless you have 10,000 followers.
I think it was 10,000, or we won't even.
Yeah,
we can't even
and
look at it.
likewise, I think we looked into a few different. Well, I mean, we certainly looked into different presses, and we're also kind of balancing again, there's balance, trying to figure out whether we wanted something that where we had no voice in how it ultimately looked, or, where it went. And if we could be with a publisher who had a little bit more, allowed us to have a little bit more of our own authenticity within the process. And we were really fortunate with Rootstock, that they, not just that they were willing to take us on in our book, but that they allowed us to be independent enough that we could have some choice in the process of, the cover art and
the size of the print and the size of the book, and they're really great to work with. You felt like you had a lot of say, and yet lots of guidance.
Yeah,
because you've never done this before.
Support.
It's a great
especially
balance.
for the first time memoir publication. So,
and when we mentioned, we have a friend who's an artist, started as an artist in retirement, and we'd like to have her do the artwork, and they said, well, we get final say. Of course they had no idea who this, and they actually loved it. Absolutely loved her artwork, and so that's became the cover.
The cover.
Yeah. Which she incorporated our shadows into the cover, so that is actually us on there.
So how did you get the title? Did you always have the title all along, or was that something that kind of popped in like one of those like 2:00 in the morning when you're writing? It's like,
I think that the title comes from the poem that we have at the beginning of the book, which is written by May Sarton, and it's a sonnet, part of her autumn sonnets. And I think that sonnet, which is about grief, but not just about grief, but I think it had spoken to me a long time ago and came back during this process. I really feel like it was like, oh, that's really meaningful and really fits so strongly with what we're feeling. And that's really where it evolved from that.
It was
poem.
Early in our writing that you read that poem to me, and I went, oh my word, that just really
and we felt like the uncertain fruit, just it resonated on several different levels.
So now that you're the two of you published your first book together, do you have that bug now to like, oh, I got another idea now, you kind of new projects popping up now?
Oh, there's always projects.
We had ideas before we even did this memoir.
For sure.
We had ideas.
So no, we're not done yet.
So we have lots of other. I've worked in social work for goodness over 30 years now, and longer if you count in high school. I began really doing social work, and there's so many personalities when you're working with people constantly. So there's so many characters and personalities and situations to draw from in that realm that I have several ideas that we just, and to help people understand other people differently, maybe see people differently than they stereotypically might think of a homeless person or someone who's suffered violence. Sometimes we have our own concept of, like I did about who was the person who would get an abortion. Like I had these stereotypes, and then it ends up very different. And so those are some of the ideas that I have.
Yes.
She comes up with the greatest children's story concepts.
We're not done yet.
Perfect. Well, so if people are interested in reading the book, where's the best place they could go to find it?
Well, the book is available through rootstockpublishing.com, but it is actually through any platform. So, and it is because it was hybrid publishing or e-publishing as well. You can get it through Amazon. You can get it as as an ebook. You can get it through pretty much anywhere that
if you go to
can purchase
wherever
a
you get
book.
books. Or your library.
Perfect.
Ask your library to buy it.
That's
There you
right.
go. That's right. Check into your local library. Perfect. Right. Well, thank you so much, Rebecca and Sallyann. This has been a great conversation. And when you get your new books, come back on. I'd love to talk to you more about it. So
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your time, Barney. This has been lovely.
Thanks for having
all
me.
right, thank you.